All right, hello everyone, and welcome to my channel. It's an educational channel. We take deep dives into great theories of everything, all-encompassing theories, earth-shattering discoveries, magnum opuses, tour de forces, mostly emanating from obscure sources. And today is our 205th video that we've done under the rubric of the Reciprocal Church. Shout out to Dewey B. Larson and his reciprocal system of theory, which we are using as a foundation for the reciprocal church. We're trying to assemble diverse and manifold techniques or just information about putting together your spiritual resources and then trying to learn how to combine them pragmatically, syncretically into your own personal spiritual practice, which will be very much more needed here in the coming time when people start to realize that the scriptures have been discredited because we will find out that the New Testament was written by the Romans. It's actually quite obvious, even if you just are in conspiracy theory 101. You would suspect the Romans to have done it if you know enough about first century history to recognize that that would be the perfect piece of wartime propaganda that they would need at the time. They had the motive, the means, the opportunity, and it resembled the method that they used in other similar situations. And that also explains why the New Testament is so pro-Roman and so anti-Jewish, because the Jews were the Romans' enemies. In Palestine, where the Romans were had their province, and the Jews were fighting back, and there was really pretty much almost really from 135 BC until 135 AD, there was pretty much constant enmity, and occasionally it would come out hot. It came out hot a lot. Revolts, insurrections, and wars between the Jews and the Romans. What better to mellow out the Jews than to give them a Prince of Peace who believes in turning the other cheek and rendering unto Caesar what is Caesar's. And so it was. Probably the most successful piece of propaganda, psyop, psychological operation ever devised. I don't think that the Romans who came up with this would even believe that 2,000 years later, 1,950 years later, this was still working. But not for long, because of people like Abelard Rushlin, who we're taking a look at his work here, which is called The True Authorship of the New Testament. It's just a little booklet that came out in 1971, and he did some heavy digging to get to this information. He pretty much narrowed it down to one Roman family who wrote all of the New Testament over the period of about 70 years. And he identifies which ones of them wrote which ones. And that was done mainly by playing what Robert Eisenman calls the shell game of names. in the New Testament, also in Josephus's works, and many other ancient works, especially the letters of Pliny the Younger, Cicero, Tacitus. By paying very close attention to their private writings, they reveal all the aliases that they use for all of the things that they wrote. And this guy, Bruchlin, who was a Jew, bent over backwards to figure this out, and he also pins them down to writing a whole lot of other stuff besides just the Gospels. And he even pins down the Quran on this same family. The Quran has the same characters as the New Testament, but also all of the early church fathers, the Apocrypha, both the Jewish and the Gnostic Apocrypha, and kind of just pretty much anything that was written in Greek or Latin. So that does exclude the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were discovered in the 1940s and 50s, but date back to this time period also. So it's possible that they used the Dead Sea Scrolls as kind of the script to get started with, the story that the fiction was based on. And he says that there was a really Roman Piso, another one of the authors who independently came up with these same ideas, says that, who also claims to have been a long lost descendant of these Pisos, the Arius Calpurnius Piso is who he says wrote the New Testament, most of it, certainly the Gospels. And let's see, he says that these people were writing this. I guess I just lost my train of thought. Hopefully I'll get it back here. But while I'm flummoxed, maybe I can just start to read from this section. And this section is called the Inner Circle, or the IC. He says that many people throughout history have also known this, and have written about it to the extent that they dared to, because all of the kings and the queens and the popes and so on, they all know this, according to him. Not sure about that, but the Piso part is, I think, quite solid, because he reconstructs their language and their aliases and plays the shell game of names, and kind of pins them all down. And so they were the early church fathers, and they were many of our classical scholars, such as Philo and even Aristotle, possibly, Tacitus was in on it, Seneca was in on it. They had formed what was called the committee to form a new Roman religion, and that was put together way back in the probably the 30s by Emperor Tiberius, and that's where Seneca Seneca and Piso's father Lucius and his uncle Gaius were part of that group, and they put something together which they called Ur Marcus, the first book of Mark, and Ur Matthias, and I think those were the Q Gospel, because they reformulated them, but they presented them to Nero, who was emperor from 54 to 68 AD, and Nero didn't like it, and they started to plan his assassination, and they got caught by Nero, and he executed them. Seneca and Lucius Piso. And so, kind of to spite back, the Pisos put together this kind of lifelong crusade to put together Christianity um, to bolster their own power as a family. They had Herodian blood in their genes as well, which were the Roman puppets, the somewhat Jewish Hasmonean or Maccabean, descended puppet rulers of Palestine. And so they wanted to come up with this Prince of Peace, and they composed these Gospels really as plays. They wrote themselves into the scripts, and they performed them all over the Roman Empire in the 80s and 90s AD, and the first at the early 2nd century, especially Pliny the Younger. And they performed these plays in front of, the Gentiles and the Jews, slaves, military soldiers, and apparently it didn't really do that well. And Christianity kind of floundered all the way up until the 300s when Constantine made it official. So Piso kind of really says that Christianity was really only on paper up until 310 or so. Let's see what Abelard Rushlin has to say here. No, he's talking about the Jews, especially the ones that wrote the Talmud, which was really like the Pharisees, and the Talmud is like kind of a literary undertaking that was more or less sponsored by the Romans, maybe as part of a war concession from the war of the Jews between 66 and 73 AD that Josephus writes about. Now he says that Josephus is Arius Piso. So Josephus is really the guy who wrote the New Testament, but Josephus is really Arius Calpurnius Piso. Josephus is just one of his many pseudonyms. And if you read Josephus's Wars of the Jews in unison with the New Testament, which is something that you can do yourself, you can go out and put online and get your copy of Josephus, the complete works of Josephus. Read Wars of the Jews and read the New Testament, and you will see hundreds, if not thousands, of parallels. You will see mockery. You will see taunting. You will see insult, and you will realize that they wrote these things together as part of wartime propaganda. Okay, so he's talking about the people who put together the Talmud. They were forced to resort to code. The Pisos, through imperial power, were using the new faith deliberately as their instrument of control of the masses. Writing of this openly would have brought Rome swift vengeance and the destruction of the Jewish people. As it was, by the time the Third Jewish Revolt was crushed in 135, about half of the 8 million Jews in the empire as of the year 65 had perished in the wars. The Jewish response after 135 was to turn away from the worldly politics and inward to the world of Talmudic study. Some illustrations of Jewish code responses have been stated, but for this explanation, a detailed summary is not necessary. For the proof in the writings of the Pisos and the other non-Jewish writers then, and likewise since, should be amply sufficient. Many pages could be spent detailing the great numbers of writers who have used the Piso numbers. That's kind of his signature. He has certain numbers that he uses. Same with Josephus, who is also Piso, but as well as Tacitus and Pliny. They have their numbers, which they use to kind of sign their names to these things in code so that you won't figure it out, but that eventually history will figure it out. Many pages could be spent detailing the great numbers of writers who use the Piso numbers and the other inner circle illusions since the 1st century. A few examples will suffice. I want to make one thing perfectly clear. My first day in office was a perfect day. So he's saying that poor, poor, that these are code words for Piso, I believe, or Calpurnius. You know, again, I think Reuchlin, he has the evidence, but he doesn't present his best evidence in many cases. So it is far beyond our poor power to add to or detract. 7 years ago, that is 87. Should be noted that it was in fact then 87 years since the Declaration of Independence, but this speech is the only one of Lincoln's speeches which he started with a number. 14 Stations of the Cross, 14-point peace plan, 16 ton, and what do you get? When you were sweet 16, the power of positive thinking, possibility thinking, Shylock, Sherlock. He does say that the Sherlock Holmes stories are, if you know the code, you can see that they knew the code, or the guy who wrote those, whatever his name was, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And the Doughboys of World War I became the G.I. Joes of World War II. That's Joe of Josephus. See, this isn't particularly convincing for me, but we'll keep going. There were originally 14 Wizard of Oz books. Later, there were 40. Both of those are Calpurnius's numbers. Arthur Conan Doyle wrote 56 Sherlock Holmes stories plus 4 short stories for a total of 60. Another one of his numbers. An itinerant clergyman, politician denigrated the Holocaust with the allegation that 60 million blacks were exterminated during the era of slavery. We all know the famous evangelists who claimed that they had visions of the Lord at their age of 14 or 16. Fictionalized rewrites of the hidden career of Piso or Josephus, the same, appear in the lives of Apollonius, of Tiana, and of Judah Ben-Hur. I believe that's the movie from 1958 even. The Judean Price, who was galley slave number 60 until he was adopted by the Roman admiral to become young Arius, same name as Piso. So might want to check out that Ben-Hur movie. I think that also, if you're watching the Ben-Hur movie, if you watch very closely, you can see a car driving in the background. So that's what I've heard. I haven't bothered to watch it, but maybe it's a good idea. Inner circle illusions in numbers, names, and various types of clues and hints are all through the world's literature. The Gesta Romanorum, the Decameron, Shakespeare, Cervantes, Rabelais, Tolstoy, Milton, Spencer, Tennyson, Thackeray, Kipling, Stevenson, Poe, Burns, Browning, Noyes, Pinocchio, Peter Pan, and ad infinitum. I would start with Shakespeare. You can take a look at Joseph Atwill's book, Shakespeare's Secret Messiah, and also John Hudson's book that is called Shakespeare's Dark Lady. And they both argue that Shakespeare was really Amelia Bassano and that she was a Jew. And that her whole thing was that the works of William Shakespeare are a reversal of the wartime propaganda from the Romans to the Jews. This is coming from the Jews to the Romans. Apparently also Christopher Marlowe was in on it, and that might have had something to do with his early death. But Atwill shows, and Hudson show, that every single one of Shakespeare's plays is about the Romans and the Jews, and that the Gospels or the New Testament is a forgery, or is a psyop, or a propaganda piece used as a wartime piece against the Jews. And Emilio Bassano reverses that. And we'll get into that more on this channel as we move further into this unit. But every one of the plays, and if you've read a little bit of Shakespeare, you know how most of Shakespeare's plays don't make any sense. You can maybe grasp the general plot, but there's so much in there that you don't get. But if you read it with that code in mind, and with a little bit of help from Hudson, who's a Shakespearean scholar, and Atwill, you can make sense of the entire corpus of Shakespeare, according to them. I've only read a couple, obviously Romeo and Juliet, the Romans and the Jews. Okay, as just one example, the poem which introduces Alice in Wonderland mentions prima, secunda, and tertia. These are feminine forms of three of our old friends. That is, I know Secundus was Pliny, but prima, not sure. So these are feminine forms of three of our old friends. Also read Kipling's story, the Bisara of Puere. Bisara was the Hebrew word for glad tidings, or gospel in English. Puere was an allusion to Mr. Poor. Sherlock Holmes' very last words to Watson in the very last story were, "Someday, Watson, the true story may be told." Long before, in The Merchant of Venice, Shakespeare prophesied, "Truth will come to light. In the end, truth will out." To me, that's utterly unconvincing, but he put it in there anyway. Today, inner circle numbers and other illusions appear not only in books and stories, but also in motion pictures, television, and advertising. The inner circle continues inexorably to expand. It was Piso himself who made possible all this deciphering and all the resulting allusions to his secret work. The New Testament is decipherable only because, in addition to being a mass murderer and the greatest writer and fabricator who ever lived, Piso was the world's greatest egotist. He could not resist piling clue after clue and code system after code system into the New Testament. He also repeatedly mocked his own work. In Acts 13, verse 6, he and Justus, his son, inserted a false prophet named Bar-Jesus, son of Jesus, which is Justus, because Piso is Jesus. He wrote himself into the play. In 2 Corinthians 12, verse 16, Justus, writing as Paul, boasted that he was crafty and took the believers in by deceit. This knowledge was not intended for the average person, but only for those somehow privileged to be members of this inner circle. In C.S. Lewis's The Inner Ring, which appears in his work, The Weight of Glory, he wrote, quote, and, C.S. Lewis is generally considered to be a very Christian author, but apparently he knew the game, and his quote says, but your genuine inner ring exists for exclusion. There'd be no fun in it. There'd be no fun if there were no outsiders. The invisible line would have no meaning unless most people were on the wrong side of it. Exclusion is no accident. It is the essence. Again, that's too vague for me to be any type of conclusive, but it is maybe suggestive. Piso's system and later variations of it by means of new holy books such as the Quran, Marx's Capital, Mein Kampf, the Book of Mormon, has always been the ideal method with which to control people. Piso, his family and friends were Stoics until they created Christianity and changed into the Church Fathers. Stoics believe that people are motivated by and controllable through fear and hope. Piso's creation continued that method. And certainly, if you look at one of the major Stoics of the Romans was Seneca, and much of the New Testament is lifted right up from one of Seneca's works, which I can't remember the name of. But so Seneca was executed by Nero in 65 AD, and the Gospels were backdated by 40 years. They were written in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, but they were set in the 20s, in the early 30s. And the one of the reasons was because the prophecies that Jesus makes are fulfilled by Titus, the general of the Romans in the War of the Jews. So when Jesus predicts something to happen, including the second coming, that is fulfilled 40 years later by Titus in the war against the Jews. So that is, and so as a result, many sects of Christianity use Josephus as part of the canon of their Bible. Part of their Bible was Josephus's Wars of the Jews, until they realized that it was kind of a double bind, because even though it proved, so-called proved, that Jesus was a prophet and that he predicted these things, but what he predicted was that Titus was his second coming. And so it traps them into accepting Titus as the second coming of Jesus. The emperor, he eventually became the emperor, Roman emperor. So it was kind of a trick. Apparently, the preterist sect still has Josephus, to this day, has Josephus as part of their Bible. But as we're finding out, Josephus was actually Calpurnius Piso. So Piso's system and later variation of it by means of new holy books, such as, about the Stoics. Okay, always the Jews have been available as the repeated scapegoat for those who led or wished to lead the common folk, just as Piso himself made the Jews the scapegoat forevermore in his story, because their ancestors refused to accept it. Quoting Matthew 27:25, his blood be on us and on our children. The Jews. Those Christians, certainly not loving Christians by today's standards, who have been professional Jew haters, have loved using inner circle illusions when spreading hatred against Jews. And he cites 6 examples. The tall pointed hat, which medieval Jews were forced to wear, was called the carnatum pileum, because its initials were CP, Calpurnius Piso. Second example, the wandering Jew in Christian folklore was named sometimes Joseph, as in Josephus Caraphilus, for it contained the letters rearranged of Calpus, and this name had the initials JC, and it also contained the rearranged letters of the name Arius. Third example, Nazi Joseph Goebbels in 1935 said, "Jewry must perish," has been our battle cry for the last 14 years. Next example, when Hitler launched Kristallnacht, the Nazis then announced that only 36 Jews had been killed and 36 injured. 36 was Josephus's number. None of this is even remotely convincing to me. I'm totally convinced by the book, but these examples that he's giving, if you go with his conclusions, and then you go to somebody like Joseph Atwill or Michael Menescatz for the evidence, you're probably doing better, because he's got Reuchlin has the evidence, but he just doesn't deploy it. He deploys stuff that is based on this numerology and just kind of like asides that people make. He could have just piled on a ton of evidence here, and he's not doing it. So it's a little frustrating. But we will continue. Read Encyclopedia Britannica on anti-Semitism. Notice its discussion of fictional protocols of the learned elders of Zion. Britannica explains that supposedly these writings were based on secret Jewish meetings, number either 24 or 27. Those were Josephus and Pliny. So the KKK's name was from the Greek kuklos, which meant circle, and each of the 3 Ks in Greek was 20, added total to 60. Yeah, the numerology isn't down my alley. I'm a big numbers guy, but just not that way. So we'll start. I think we'll finish this tomorrow, but hopefully he'll get into some more convincing evidence. And if not, there's plenty more evidence that we will be deploying in future episodes. Thanks for tuning in today.